This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're continuing on this historic release, unprecedented release of diplomatic cables. It's happening over the next weeks or months. The total believed to be over 250,000. It's been released by WikiLeaks, the whistleblower website. My guests for the hour are Daniel Ellsberg, who is the premier whistleblower in the United States, released the Pentagon Papers 39 years ago, 40 years ago. He worked a high-level official in the Pentagon. He had top security clearance, which is how he got these documents, also worked for the RAND Corporation. We're also joined by As'ad AbuKhalil, a professor from University of California System. Greg Mitchell is with us from The Nation magazine. And we're also joined by Carne Ross. Carne Ross is a former British diplomat who quit over the Iraq War. Dan Ellsberg, I wanted to go back to you to get you to comment on Democratic Senator John Kerry's comments on WikiLeaks, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, called the release reckless and said, quote, "This is not an academic exercise about freedom of information, and it is not akin to the release of the Pentagon Papers, which involved an analysis aimed at saving American lives and exposing government deception. Instead, these sensitive cables contain candid assessments and analysis of ongoing matters, and they should remain confidential to protect the ability of the government to conduct lawful business with a private candor that's vital to effective diplomacy." Dan Ellsberg, your response.
Oh, blah. Senator Kerry is still reeling, I'm afraid, from the battering he got from the Swift boat liars who were said to have said at the time, when we get through with John Kerry, people won't know which side he fought on in Vietnam. They took a war hero and made him into a hoax, basically, and he's been trying to establish his macho credentials ever since. It's not his finest hour to say silly things, such as the quote you just described. Let me put, though, these papers in some perspective. Most of your people, except for Carne Ross, to some extent John Kerry, are really not familiar with the levels of classification here, and a lot of silly things have been said about them ignorantly. The fact is that these are quite low-level documents. They're equivalent to the field-level documents on the civilian side that we saw in the Afghan and Iraq documents that WikiLeaks earlier released. So they're not the Pentagon Papers in terms of top-secret, high-level decision-making papers. When the Times heights its documents, or the other papers, as being prepared for high-level policymakers, that's just false. Probably no high-level policymaker even saw one of these secret documents. And I'll give you one piece of background on that. When I worked for an Assistant Secretary of Defense in 1964-65 on Vietnam alone, I wanted to inform him as to what he ought to look at in the course of his day in the way of these very same cables from just from Vietnam alone. And I asked for the whole take, the whole set of cables of all kinds from that area. So I came into my office in the morning, and I find as high as my head, 5.5 feet high, I was just a couple of inches higher than that, 2 volumes of paper, 2 piles of paper for me to look at. I couldn't even whip through it into the burn bag without reading most of that stuff. So I had to give the directive, cut out the secret documents, leave me only those that are no-dis, ex-dis, lim-dis, that's limited distribution, or eyes only, and top secret or higher. And that cut me down to 2 piles, each 2.5 feet high, or 5 feet of paper instead of 11 feet of paper. In short, what I'm reading in this, and it's very familiar to me from my days in Vietnam, when I wrote this sort of cable and sent it out from Vietnam back to Washington, what we're reading is the sort of thing that I, in Washington, didn't have time to read. It just wasn't important. So I think you can say that probably no Assistant Secretary or Hillary Clinton ever laid eyes on any of these cables. They're not, for example, the Eikenberry cable, which was genuinely very revealing, that was given to the New York Times from our general in Kabul, that revealed his opinion that General McChrystal's program, which which Obama actually followed, was hopeless and counterproductive and would in no way improve the situation. Now, that cable was only secret, but it was no-dis, and it had a code word. That meant it was very carefully closed. It was the sort of thing I would have seen if I'd been in the Pentagon, as a no-dis cable. In short, we're not seeing high-level decision-making paper. For what it's worth, we are finding that the big problem with our awful, miserable, incompetent foreign policy in Iraq and Afghanistan is not the fault of foolish, stupid, or lying middle-level staffers down below. They're speaking fairly honestly, not with a lot of local knowledge often, but fairly shrewdly in many cases, doing their best job to their superiors. The lying, as in Vietnam, is being enforced by the upper levels. What we need to see, really, is someone following Bradley Manning, or whoever the source is, following his example. He gave what he could at his 22-year-old's level, corporal's level, of what was available to him to inform the public. We need somebody with higher access, the kind I had at that time, and unfortunately didn't use them. I'm sorry to say, I apologize. But somebody to put out the higher-level papers that reveal the high-level dealing and stupid formulations, theories, madman theories, and others that are informing our policy, so that the American people can begin to get some grip on our incoherent policy and enforce a more humane and productive thrust to it.
Our former British diplomat in studio here, Carne Ross, is shaking his head.
I have to disagree with Daniel Ellsberg. I mean, the telegrams that I've seen, including the secret classified stuff, is the meat and drink of diplomacy. My foreign secretary read this stuff every day, a thick folder of it, as I did in the Foreign Office. I don't know how things work in the US government, but my experience working on Iraq is that the top secret stuff, the intelligence-based stuff, is the least accurate form of reporting that you get. What foreign leaders are saying to American diplomats or British diplomats in confidential discussions is enormously important. Records of what King Abdullah said or President Saleh of Yemen said would be of great interest to senior officials in the State Department or indeed the NSC or the White House. So I have to disagree with Daniel Ellsberg's analysis. This stuff is very, very revealing of the everyday meat and drink of American diplomacy.
I wanted to talk about what the mainstream press in America is mainly focusing on. The documents describing French President Nicolas Sarkozy as touchy, authoritarian, as an emperor without clothes. They say German Chancellor Angela Merkel is someone who avoids risk. They call her the Teflon leader. Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi incapable. They also describe Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin as an alpha dog, while Russian President Dmitry Medvedev is pale and hesitant and plays Robin to Putin's Batman. And much has been written about the cable that reports Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi never travels without his trusted Ukrainian nurse, a, quote, voluptuous blonde. Greg Mitchell, the significance of other leaks that have come out in this trove of documents, how the hacker attacks which forced Google to quit China in January were orchestrated by a senior member of the Politburo who typed his own name into the global version of the search engine and found articles criticizing him personally. But what China did with Google's information.
Right. Well, there's a whole list of those that are going to be coming out in further detail. We don't know a lot about that yet because all the cables have not been released. But as you say, the American media has often focused on what others call gossip, and that really is the one day material that's going to be reported. What's more important is what's going to come out. And it's interesting that looking at it from a media aspect is the calls that we're starting to hear now. So the one bipartisan thing we're seeing out of Washington is Democrats and Republican top senators calling for prosecution of WikiLeaks, for stopping the documents, somehow preventing the documents from being released. And we've seen
Graham and others calling for
Joe Lieberman just is the most recent one. Quite a detailed call saying this is a national security threat. Peter King said it was the same thing as a military attack, likening it to an attack on the U.S. So, but so far that hasn't gotten anywhere, and there hasn't been a serious move to prevent the further dissemination or to stop, as we saw at the Pentagon Papers, the actual newspapers printing documents. So. We haven't seen that yet, but we have seen some elegant defenses of publishing the documents, particularly in The Guardian, Simon Jenkins and others there, and in the New York Times note on why they published the documents. And they emphasize that it's not the press's role to keep the government from suffering embarrassment. And they also, as he mentioned earlier, the importance of using the example of the false information that was spread about Iraqi WMDs, that if material like this had come out at that time, it would have had a tremendous impact on perhaps halting what became the invasion of Iraq.
Of course, there is the Swedish warrant out for Julian Assange's arrest,
right,
which has been very long and complicated. First they issued one, then they didn't, and then they did. And
right.
I wanted to talk about Bradley Manning for a minute. The U.S. military believes the leak can be traced to Private First Class Bradley Manning, who's been held in solitary confinement for the last 7 months and is facing a court-martial next year. In an online conversation with computer hacker Adrian Lamo, who would later turn him in, Manning said, quote, "Hillary Clinton and several thousand diplomats around the world are going to have a heart attack when they wake up one morning and find an entire repository of classified foreign policy is available in searchable format to the public. Everywhere there's a U.S. post, there's a diplomatic scandal that will be revealed. It's open diplomacy, worldwide anarchy in CSV format. It's ClimateGate with a global scope and breathtaking depth. It's beautiful and horrifying." Those are the words of Bradley Manning, 22 years old, low level, in Iraq, coming in with his Lady Gaga CD, saying it was Lady Gaga, and downloading all this information. Is this possible? Dan Ellsberg, I want to put that question to you. You've been raising money for his defense.
Well, clearly what's possible to 22-year-old Manning, who was, by the way, 7 years younger, I think probably 20 or so when he actually started this process. What's available to him is probably available to 500,000 or 600,000 people available to SIPRNet. And notice that the thing that first struck him was his realization that he was involved in the arrest process of people who he later discovered were doing nothing other than writing what he called scholarly critiques of the current administration, for which they were being tortured by the Iraqis to whom we were turning them over with the knowledge of Americans. All of this being blatantly illegal, both for the Iraqis and for the Americans who turned them over to torture. And when he reported this to his superior told him to forget it and get back to work arresting people. The effect that had on Bradley Manning was that he was being asked to participate in a blatantly illegal process, and he chose to say no to it, to expose it, to resist it, to do what he actually should have done. One person out of hundreds of thousands who did that. The material that he revealed in the Iraq logs that were just revealed recently, some 400,000 logs, revealed hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of Americans who reported that they understood they were turning people over to be tortured, clearly against U.S. and international law, and they were then being ordered not to pursue the investigation further or take any measure to stop this illegal process. Now, that order was blatantly illegal. So it would be interesting to take a look at those thousands of cases and just see which one led to a refusal to carry out that blatantly illegal order, as the UCMJ requires them to do. Bradley Manning seems to have been the one who did that, the one who lived up to his oath of office, and the one who acted patriotically here to stop this illegal process. For that, he'll pay very heavily. And yet, he may yet inspire some other people to do the same, to save lives, to stop processes of torture, and to reveal, by the way, the absolute lack of progress that's revealed throughout all of these documents. The 260,000 documents.
Do you think it's possible, Dan, we only have 5 seconds. Do you think it's possible he's alone in releasing this information?
In terms of access to the information, he's certainly not alone. In terms of ability to download it, not alone, although they have tightened up the procedures as a result of what they found about him and how he's revealed how he did it. For that, perhaps to give him a medal for improving this.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you all for being with us. Daniel Ellsberg of Pentagon Papers, whistleblower, Carne Ross, former British diplomat, Greg Mitchell of The Nation, and As'ad AbuKhalil, California professor. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.